Here's a bunch of reasons why it is normal to not know that you had a traumatic childhood. People kind of wake up to their trauma in their 20s, 30s, well on into like even late adulthood. And that's not weird, it's actually common. The first and biggest part in my mind is always attachment. Our need, like biological need, survival need, as young children is to align with our caregivers as much as possible so that they will be as good to us as we can get them to be to us, and or to reduce as much harm as possible. And so the degree to which we are wired to be chameleons and to blend with our family at basically any cost to ourselves just can't really be understated. I think sometimes people think, oh, it makes sense to people please your parents if they're pretty good, but if they're really terrible to you, then that doesn't make sense. But that's not true. It doesn't matter how awful your parents were. It still made sense for you as a child to try to adopt their worldview, to try to appease them, to please them, to mirror them, whatever. But of course, that's also true for families that are like only subtly traumatic or like mildly abusive. Anywhere on the spectrum, it makes sense. Second reason in my mind is our normal is our normal. And that persists even when you make friends with people who had different experiences to you. You are still likely to just think, oh, well, they got lucky or they were super privileged, as opposed to seeing that you were disadvantaged. For the vast majority of us, we learned to invalidate our own emotions because others invalidated them so frequently. So when we start thinking, oh, maybe that was pretty bad, or maybe that did really hurt me, it's really second nature to say, I'm just being dramatic, or oh, I must be misremembering, or an endless number of other reasons or excuses to minimize those thoughts and feelings when they do come up, because we're just used to not taking our own side in things because that was our childhood experience, was that others didn't take our side or they didn't encourage us to believe ourselves. For many, they knew others who they saw as having it worse. I noticed at some point in my own healing journey that my definition for what an abusive family was in all kinds of different areas, sexual, emotional, physical, was always one notch higher than what I experienced. So that's how I had convinced myself that I hadn't experienced any kind of abuse, was that my definition for abuse was higher than my own experience because my experience was normal. And in all of those categories, I did know people, in some cases lots of people, who had it sometimes lots worse than me. But I think that like there was just a point where it hit me that like it's not just a coincidence that my experience is always this close to being abused but is never abuse. Instead, my definition for what constitutes abuse was increased, falsely increased, to protect my experiences so that I didn't have to call them abuse. The impact of our experiences isn't always super directly obvious to the source. And so while we might struggle with our mental health, lots of people get diagnosed with like anxiety or depression and think that's a chemical imbalance or that it's like a purely genetic thing. They don't realize that it was linked to trauma because they aren't actively thinking about their trauma all the time, and so it doesn't seem obviously related. Like I have social anxiety, but so I would be anxious at like stopping to ask somebody in a gas station for directions. But I would think to myself, I have no reason to be anxious right now because I don't have trauma of stopping to ask somebody for directions and them being cruel to me. But, or just overreacting to me or whatever. And so I thought that I had all these specific social fears that didn't relate to my experiences because I wasn't understanding that the trauma is way more vague than those individual situations. For years, I thought I just was like naturally anxious. It turns out that like literally every anxiety I have comes back to trauma in some way or another. Like none of it's random. I used to think it was all random. Our siblings might cope in different ways than we did, and so that can make us question our own struggles. Again, I'll use the social anxiety answer. I know that my social anxiety is from attachment trauma, but I have siblings that don't have social anxiety. And so that kind of a thing can make me think, well, it must be a personal flaw that I develop social anxiety because they don't have social anxiety. But then they might have struggles that I don't, and that doesn't mean that their struggles aren't also from the same trauma. It's just that we cope differently or we were impacted differently. But I think that's a really big one that people compare and contrast to siblings. I always heard that narrative of if there's like two kids that grew up in the same house and one of them ends up with like a substance problem or some other like clearly unhealthy behavior and the other one seems to function better, then the like good kid or the high functioning kid will be kind of used as an example for why the bad kid's problems aren't really caused by the childhood situation. But that's just not true. Like the one who's high functioning is probably like super anxious or depressed or, internalizing their stuff or something. Like they're being impacted in some way. I think a lot of times kids who grew up in a certain type of trauma environment will have like aunts and uncles who raised their kids in similar ways. Their parents' friends may have raised their children in similar ways. And so that can really put you in kind of like a cultural bubble to where it really, really normalizes certain types of abuse. Like I definitely think this is the case for things like emotional abuse, things like corporal punishment, even things like not using car seats properly. People like who don't use their car seats safely tend to be friends with other people who don't use their car seats correctly with their children. At least that's something I feel like I've observed. And so for those kids who grow up being raised that way and seeing other people raised, other children being raised the same way around them, it is just normal. They're in a bubble. The external family image really throws a lot of people off. I see this all the time in like the CPTSD subreddit. People talking about how they had this like picture perfect family or they were well respected in the community. And so people get this sense that, well, everybody thinks my mom and dad are great, so I must be the crazy one for thinking that they hurt me or that they weren't the best parent ever. Another common one that I see trip people up was, but I was spoiled or I was privileged. We got to go on vacations. I had all the best clothes. That kind of, I think, is often internalizing their parents' view of parenting, which was that they had to take care of their physical needs and not their emotional needs. But getting a new PlayStation or going on vacations doesn't make you not emotionally neglected or not emotionally abused or not sexually abused. But I do think there's kind of a stereotype of thinking of like unhealthy families or abusive families or toxic families as struggling financially as well, and that's not always the case. The cartoon villain stereotype. So a lot of people think that an abusive parent would always be cruel, would always be cold, would have bad intentions, like on purpose. A lot of times people have a really mixed bag. In my case, I knew that some things from my childhood were problematic. I didn't realize the degree to which things were really messed up until starting therapy 3 years ago when I was 30. And sometimes it's still a little wild to realize how much I've discovered, and it's all things I kind of knew but also kind of didn't know. It's like you saw it but you didn't understand the full impact, or you really minimized it. And that's really normal. But also some percentage of people do have like completely repressed memories that come up later, so that can be a factor in this too. But even without repressed memories, I think it's quite normal to not really see your childhood accurately until you start doing healing work.